Ibrahim Traoré was about to board the plane when he read the message on his phone. French visa denied. This insult would become the beginning of a new African unity. The presidential motorcade had just arrived at Ouagadougo International Airport. Under the harsh West African sun, military personnel stood at attention, their uniforms crisp despite the humid heat. Officials from various ministries had gathered on the tarmac, a sea of formal attire and expectant faces. The red carpet stretched from the motorcade to the stairs of the presidential aircraft, a symbol of diplomatic protocol that had been meticulously prepared for this significant occasion. This trip had been planned for months, Traoré's first official visit to Paris as Burkina Faso's president. The agenda included meetings with the French president, economic ministers, and business leaders. At stake were crucial negotiations about resource contracts, security cooperation, and developmental aid. For a country still navigating the complex legacy of colonial rule, such high-level diplomatic engagement was vital, if delicate. Traoré stepped out of his vehicle, acknowledging the salutes with the measured composure that had become his trademark. At 34, he was among Africa's youngest leaders, having risen to power through a commitment to national sovereignty that resonated deeply with a population tired of foreign influence masquerading as partnership. His foreign minister, Ouagadougo, approached immediately, his normally impassive diplomatic face betraying unusual tension. He held out his phone. "Mr. President, there's a situation," he said quietly, ensuring his words wouldn't carry to the assembled dignitaries. Traoré took the device, scanning the email displayed on the screen. The message from the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs was brief and coldly formal. The French Republic regrets to inform that the visa request for Ibrahim Traoré has been denied under Article 32 of the Visa Code on grounds of national security. The scheduled meetings with French officials are hereby cancelled. Traoré read the message twice, his expression unchanged. Around him, the farewell ceremony continued. The military band prepared to play the national anthem. Officials waited to make their formal goodbyes, all unaware of the diplomatic earthquake that had just occurred. "Your orders, sir?" asked Ouagadougo, his voice barely audible. Traoré handed back the phone. "No announcement yet. Let's move to the VIP lounge." As they walked across the tarmac, maintaining the appearance of normalcy, Traoré's mind raced through the implications. This was unprecedented. A former colonial power denying entry to the head of state of its former colony, a country where France still maintained significant economic interests. The timing was clearly deliberate, calculated for maximum humiliation, waiting until he was literally about to board the plane, with all ceremonial preparations complete. In the privacy of the airport's VIP lounge, his security team and closest advisors gathered, faces grave as Ouagadougo explained the situation. "This is a direct response to your uranium mining decision last month," said Defense Minister Traoré, a veteran military officer whose loyalty to Burkina Faso had been proven through decades of service. "They're sending a message." Traoré nodded. 3 weeks earlier, he had announced the cancellation of a mining contract that had given a French corporation exclusive rights to Burkina Faso's uranium deposits on terms highly unfavorable to the African nation. The decision had sent shockwaves through Paris. The terms were essentially colonial, Traoré had explained to his citizens in a televised address. Burkina Faso received less than 10% of the value extracted while our people suffered the environmental and health consequences. "Options?" Traoré asked, looking around the room at his advisors. "We could issue a formal protest," suggested Foreign Minister Ouagadougo. "Summon their ambassador for explanation." "That's what they expect," said Finance Minister Ouagadougo, a sharp-minded economist who had studied in Paris before returning to serve her country. A toothless response they can ignore while they continue economic pressure. "They want us to feel small," added Dio, Traoré's chief of staff, "to remind us that despite our formal independence, they still control access to international platforms." Traoré walked to the window, watching as the plane that was supposed to carry him to Paris was being prepared for departure. The Burkinabe flag painted on its tail caught the morning sunlight, a symbol of sovereignty that suddenly seemed hollow in the face of such blatant disrespect. ECO was Diplomatic Response Unit to coordinate reactions to future diplomatic slights or pressure tactics. This isn't about antagonism, Traoré emphasized, his voice echoing through the chamber. It's about equality, about being treated as sovereign nations, not former colonies. Nigeria's president, whose country was the region's economic powerhouse, raised a practical concern. The economic implications could be severe: tourism, business ties, investment flows. Precisely the leverage they've always used against us, Traoré countered. The threat that challenging the status quo will lead to economic harm. But consider this: what is the cost of continuing to accept diplomatic inequality? What is the price of perpetual subordination? Ghana's president, a respected elder statesman, nodded slowly. For decades, we've been told that real independence would come through economic development. Yet that development has been structured to maintain dependency. Perhaps true development begins with standing up for our dignity. As the ECOWAS leaders debated the proposal, France was mobilizing its diplomatic machinery. Calls were made to friendly African leaders. Economic pressure points were identified. Media narratives were crafted, portraying Traoré as an impulsive, radical, destabilizing regional relations. But something unexpected was happening. The story of the visa denial had struck a chord across Africa. Social media was ablaze with hashtags like African dignity and no more colonialism. Protests gathered outside French embassies in Dar es Salaam and Kinshasa. University students organized debates about neo-colonialism and diplomatic sovereignty. Most significantly, African business leaders and intellectuals were speaking out. A group of prominent entrepreneurs issued a statement supporting diplomatic reciprocity and calling for reduced economic dependence on former colonial powers. The notion that African economies cannot function without preferential relationships with former colonizers is itself a colonial mindset, wrote a renowned Senegalese economist. We have the resources, the talent, and increasingly, the capital to chart our own economic course. 3 days after the visa denial, the ECOWAS summit concluded with a historic announcement. The Ouagadougo Protocol had been adopted unanimously. 15 West African nations had agreed to stand as one in diplomatic relations with the rest of the world. In Paris, the implications were sinking in. France maintained varying degrees of economic and political influence across its former colonial empire, an arrangement that relied on bilateral relationships where power imbalances could be exploited. A unified diplomatic front fundamentally changed that equation. The French president called an emergency meeting with his foreign policy team. "We need to de-escalate," he instructed. Offer Traoré a personal apology. Blame the visa denial on a bureaucratic error. Get our diplomats back in place before we lose control of the narrative. "It's too late for that," his Africa advisor replied. "The Ouagadougou Protocol has already expanded beyond. East African nations are expressing interest. The African Union is holding a special session to discuss continent-wide adoption." "How did a simple visa denial lead to this?" the president asked, bewildered by the rapidly evolving situation. "It wasn't the denial itself," explained a senior diplomat who had served in multiple African postings. "It was the timing, the deliberate humiliation. Traoré used it as a catalyst for something that's been building for years: resentment against the persistent inequality in our diplomatic relationships." In Ouagadougou, Traoré received the news of ECOWAS's unanimous decision with quiet satisfaction. This wasn't about personal vindication, but about a principle that transcended individual leaders or nations. His phone rang, a secure line used for confidential communications between heads of state. It was the French president, calling directly for the first time. "President Traoré," the voice began without preamble. "This situation has escalated unnecessarily. I want to personally assure you that the visa denial was a regrettable administrative error We would like to welcome you to Paris at your earliest convenience to resolve any misunderstandings. Thank you for your call, Mr. President, Traoré replied. But this is no longer about a visa or a visit. The Ouagadougo Protocol isn't directed against France specifically, but addresses a broader imbalance in international relations. This protocol effectively holds French citizens hostage to political disputes, the French president objected. It will damage business ties, tourism, educational exchanges. Interesting perspective, Traoré said. African citizens have faced those exact constraints for decades. The difference is that now the situation is reciprocal. After the call, Traoré's foreign minister looked concerned. They'll retaliate economically. Aid cuts, investment freezes, trade restrictions. Undoubtedly, Traoré agreed. Which is why the diplomatic front is just the beginning. Phase 2 addresses economic sovereignty. The next week saw a flurry of diplomatic activity across Europe and Africa. France attempted to divide the ECO-West unity by offering special relationships to individual countries. The EU expressed deep concern about the reciprocal visa regulations. International media debated whether Africa was taking a radical turn. Meanwhile, Ibrahim Traoré continued building on the momentum. In a virtual summit with other ECOWAS leaders, he presented the second phase of what was now being called the Ouagadougo Doctrine. Diplomatic sovereignty is meaningless without economic sovereignty, he told his counterparts. The leverage our former colonizers hold over us isn't just about visas and official recognition. It's about our resources, our markets, our financial systems. The proposal was ambitious, a gradual restructuring of economic relationships with former colonial powers, prioritizing intra-African trade, establishing an ECOWAS investment bank to reduce dependence on foreign capital, and coordinated renegotiation of resource extraction contracts. We're not calling for isolation or economic warfare, Traoré emphasized. We're calling for partnership based on mutual benefit rather than continued extraction. As the summit progressed, news arrived that further strengthened the African position. China and Russia had officially announced that they would recognize and respect the Ouagadougou Protocol with simplified visa procedures for all ECOWAS citizens. Turkey, Brazil, and India quickly followed suit. This is not about replacing Western influence with Eastern influence, Traoré clarified when questioned about these developments. It's about diversifying our international relationships to create genuine choices. Any nation that treats us with respect will find us ready to engage constructively. The global diplomatic landscape was shifting. Former colonial powers were losing their privileged access to African markets and resources, while emerging powers were establishing new relationships based on the principles of the Ouagadougou Protocol. 2 weeks after the initial visa denial, the French government announced a complete reversal of its position. Not only was President Traoré welcome in France, but a new simplified visa system would be implemented for all citizens of former French colonies. But it was too late to return to the status quo. The momentum behind the Ouagadougou Protocol and doctrine had grown beyond any single country's control. At an extraordinary session of the African Union in Addis Ababa, the protocol was adopted continent-wide, creating the most unified African diplomatic position since the organization's founding. Ibrahim Traoré was invited to address the AU Assembly, an unusual honor for a relatively new head of state. As he stood at the podium, looking out at representatives from 54 African nations, he reflected on how far a simple visa denial had led. Distinguished colleagues, the true significance of the Ouagadougou Protocol is not in its specific provisions, he began. It is in what it represents. Africa speaking with one voice, standing as equals in the international community, not as supplicants or former subjects. He continued, his voice growing stronger. For centuries, the narrative about Africa has been written by others. Our resources labeled discoveries when Europeans found what we already knew existed. Our borders drawn in European capitals without regard for our people's realities. Our economic value measured only in what could be extracted, not what could be built. The assembly was silent, absorbed in his words. That narrative is ending, not because we reject partnership with the wider world, but because true partnership can only exist between equals. The Ouagadougo Protocol is simply a statement of that equality, a declaration that Africa's dignity is non-negotiable. As Traoré concluded his address, the assembly rose in a standing ovation. The message was clear. A new era in international relations had begun, catalyzed by a simple denied visa and transformed by a leader who saw opportunity in insult. In the months that followed, the Ouagadougo Doctrine expanded beyond diplomacy and basic economics. African nations began coordinating positions on climate negotiations, trade agreements, and international security matters. Intra-African trade increased dramatically as artificial colonial barriers gave way to more natural regional relationships. Perhaps, most significantly, a psychological barrier had been broken, the presumption of Western preeminence in international relations, a legacy of colonialism that had persisted decades after formal independence was finally being challenged systematically. 1 year after the visa incident, Ibrahim Traoré did finally visit Paris, but not on the terms originally planned. He arrived as co-chair of a new AUE,